The rich son abandoned his family for 15 years and found his blind mother had raised a billionaire, a story about pride, guilt, and the strange, quiet ways life repays what we walk away from. The bus groaned to a stop at the edge of Barangay Malinao at 4:52 in the afternoon on a Friday in late November, the brakes hissing under the weight of a vehicle that had seen better decades, and Daniel Bautista stepped down onto a road he hadn't touched in 15 years, with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a suit that no longer fit him the way it once had. The fabric hanging loose at the waist from months of skipped meals he didn't like to think about. He was 43 years old, and the man who had left this village a decade and a half ago had been someone else entirely, someone with a chest full of ambition and a head full of plans, someone who had looked at the dirt road and the nipa huts and the rice paddies stretching toward the mountains and seen, with the particular cruelty of the young and hungry, only the shape of everything he intended to escape. That man had worn a different kind of hunger. This one, standing on the same road with a bag that held almost everything he owned in the world, wore hunger of a much plainer kind. He had left for Manila at 28 years old, promising his mother, who could not see the road disappearing behind him because a fever 11 years earlier had taken her sight along with almost everything else the family had scraped together, that he would build something, that he would send for her once he had a proper house, that the separation would be measured in months, not years. He remembered the exact words he had used, standing in the doorway of the small house with his mother's hand, searching blindly for his face so she could memorize it with her fingers one last time, because that was how she said goodbye to people since the fever, memorizing faces with her hands, the way sighted people memorize faces with their eyes. "I'll come back for you, Nane," he had told her. "I'll come back rich, and you'll never have to worry about anything again." 15 years had passed since that morning, and Daniel had, for a period of almost 8 of those years, actually kept a version of that promise. He had worked construction first, then sales, then talked his way into a logistics company where his sharp tongue and sharper instincts had carried him from a warehouse floor to a regional manager's office within 4 years. And by his mid-30s, he had started his own freight brokerage, riding the wave of a growing economy with the specific reckless confidence of a man who had never once, in his adult life, imagined that the wave might eventually break. It had broken 2 years ago. A partner he had trusted with the company's finances had funneled money into a side venture that collapsed, taking the brokerage down with it. And Daniel had spent the following 2 years watching everything he'd built disintegrate in the particular slow-motion horror of watching a company die by 1,000 small, unpayable debts. He had sold the condo first, then the car, then the watch his ex-wife had given him before she left, taking their daughter with her to Cebu, and a life that no longer had much room in it for a man who called less and less often, as the shame of having nothing to offer grew heavier than the shame of simply disappearing. He had not called his mother in over 3 years, not because he had stopped loving her, though he would spend a long time later trying to untangle whether that was even true, but because every phone call had become, in his mind, an accounting of failure, a chance for her to ask him, in that patient, blind voice of hers, how the business was doing, and for him to lie, and for the lie to cost him something he could no longer afford to lose. It had been easier, in the specific cowardly arithmetic of a man in freefall, to simply let the silence grow, to let years pass the way water passes over a drowning man's head, telling himself each month that he would call once things turned around, until there was no more money left to wait for a turn that never came. And he found himself on a Tuesday in November, sitting in a bus terminal in Manila with a duffel bag and enough money for a one-way ticket back to the only place left in the world where he thought someone might still let him in the door. The 8 good years, the ones he had spent actually keeping some version of his promise, had followed a shape that felt, in retrospect, almost mockingly familiar to every story of ambition curdling slowly into something else. He had started in a warehouse, loading trucks for a logistics firm at 19 pesos an hour, sleeping in a boarding house with 4 other men from the provinces, sending home whatever he could spare, which in those first 2 years had been genuine, meaningful, the closest he ever came to honoring the promise he had made his mother in the doorway. He had noticed quickly that the men who advanced past the warehouse floor were the ones who understood not the physical labor, but the invisible mathematics behind it, the routing, the margins, the small efficiencies that saved a company thousands of pesos a month if someone bothered to notice them. And Daniel had bothered relentlessly, teaching himself accounting from borrowed textbooks during his lunch breaks, until a regional manager noticed him doing math on a scrap of cardboard that the manager's own supervisors hadn't thought to do, and pulled him off the floor within the year. By 32, he had his own small brokerage, 3 employees and a rented office above a hardware store, moving freight between provincial ports with a hustle that impressed everyone who dealt with him. And by 35, that brokerage had grown into something with 40 employees and contracts with companies whose names appeared in the business section of national newspapers. And it was somewhere in that growth, Daniel would admit much later to himself, in the quiet, unforgiving hours of his eventual collapse, that the calls home had started thinning, not out of any decision he consciously made, but out of the same gradual erosion that happens to anyone who becomes convinced that the version of himself still climbing is more important than the version of himself who once made a promise in a doorway to a woman who could no longer see his face. He had married during those years too, a woman named Liza, who worked in the same industry and understood better than most the demands of his growing business. And they had a daughter, Isabel. And for a period of perhaps 3 years, Daniel had genuinely believed he had built exactly the life he set out from that village to build. A wife, a child, a company with his name on the door, an apartment in a good part of Quezon City with air conditioning in every room, and a maid who cleaned it. The specific glossy proof of arrival that he had once imagined would feel like enough to finally justify everything he had left behind to get it. It had not felt like enough, not for very long, because the specific hunger that had carried him out of the village in the first place did not know how to recognize a finish line, even once he had crossed it. And Daniel had kept pushing, kept expanding, kept taking on debt to grow faster than the business could safely support, kept trusting a partner named Ronnie Villaflor with the company's finances, because trusting Ronnie meant Daniel could focus entirely on growth instead of the tedious business of oversight. A decision that felt, at the time, like delegation, and that revealed itself 2 years ago to have been something closer to willful blindness. Ronnie had been funneling company funds into a real estate side venture of his own for over a year before the venture collapsed entirely, taking with it not just Ronnie's investment, but nearly all of the brokerage's working capital, discovered only when creditors began calling about invoices that should have been paid months earlier. Daniel had spent the following 18 months in a slow-motion unraveling that took his company, then his savings, then the apartment, then, eventually, his marriage. Liza leaving not out of cruelty, but out of the plain, exhausted recognition that the man she had married had disappeared somewhere inside the man, now drowning in spreadsheets and unreturned calls from lawyers. Taking Isabel with her to her own family in Cebu, a departure Daniel had not fought because some small, honest part of him agreed that his daughter deserved a version of stability he no longer had any idea how to provide. He walked from the bus stop toward the interior of the village, past a small sari-sari store that had grown into something larger and freshly painted, past a school with a new covered court where he remembered only a dirt field, past houses that seemed impossibly less poor than the ones he remembered, the whole barangay wearing a kind of quiet, solid prosperity that did not match the village of his memory at all. A memory built entirely around scarcity, around a childhood of watery lugao and second-hand clothes, and a mother who worked other people's laundry, with hands that knew the shape of every stain by touch, since she could no longer see them. He told himself the changes were probably just time. The ordinary slow improvement of any place over 15 years, remittances from other families whose children had made it further than he had. He did not yet let himself wonder what specifically might have happened to his own mother's house, whether it had improved along with everything else, or whether she had spent 15 years exactly as poor and exactly as alone as he had left her, waiting in the dark for a son who had promised to come back rich, and instead was walking toward her now with empty pockets and a suit that no longer fit. 14 years earlier, in the same small house Daniel had grown up in, his mother Rosario Bautista had been alone for barely a year when the fire happened 3 houses down. A fire that started from an overturned cooking stove on a windy night in dry season and spread faster than anyone in the barangay had time to properly understand, consuming 2 homes completely before neighbors managed to control it with buckets and prayers and the particular desperate teamwork that poor communities develop out of necessity. The Cruz family had lived in one of those 2 houses, a young couple with a 5-year-old son named Emmanuel. And by the time the fire was finally out, both parents were gone, having gone back into the burning structure to search for a boy who had, in fact, already escaped through the back window and was standing, alone and screaming, in the dark rice paddy behind the house, having watched from a distance as the home that held everything he knew collapsed into itself with his parents somewhere inside it. Rosario had been blind for 3 years by then, having lost her sight to an untreated fever when the local clinic could not afford the medicine that might have saved it in time, and she could not see the flames or the smoke that night, but she could hear the screaming, a child's voice cutting through the chaos with a specific animal terror that she recognized instantly as belonging to someone very young and very alone. And she had walked toward that sound with the particular fearless certainty of the blind, navigating a world they know by ear and memory rather than sight, until she found small hands and pulled the boy against her chest and held him there through the rest of that terrible night. Not knowing yet that both his parents were gone, only knowing that a child needed somewhere to be held. No relatives came forward in the weeks that followed. Emmanuel's mother had been an only child of parents who had died years before, and his father's family lived in a distant province and, when contacted, expressed sympathy, but no willingness to take in a child they had never met, a decision made over the telephone in the specific casual cruelty of people who have never had to hold the actual weight of the choice they're declining. The barangay captain, overwhelmed with dozens of urgent matters after the fire, asked, almost as an afterthought, whether anyone in the community could take the boy in temporarily while proper arrangements were sought. Rosario, who owned almost nothing, who had one son grown and gone to the city with promises that had already, even then, begun to feel thinner with each passing month, said yes before she had finished hearing the question completely. "I have nothing to offer him," she told the barangay captain, a woman named Aling Feli, who would repeat this story for years afterward as one of the truest things she had ever witnessed. "I cannot see him grow. I cannot read to him. I have a house with 1 room and rice most days and meat maybe twice a month. But I can hold him at night, and I can teach him what I know, and that is more than nothing, and nothing is what he has right now." The temporary arrangement became permanent within the year, the paperwork moving slowly through a system that had little urgency for a poor blind woman's request to formally adopt an orphan with no inheritance and no family fighting to claim him. But the permanence of it was never really in question in the ways that mattered. Because from that first night in the burning dark, Emmanuel Cruz had already, in every sense except the legal one, become Rosario Bautista's son. The barangay had watched this arrangement with the particular mixture of admiration and quiet worry that small communities reserve for anyone who takes on more than seems reasonable given their own circumstances. Iling Feli, the barangay captain, had visited within the first month to check on the boy, half expecting to find him malnourished or neglected simply by the arithmetic of the situation, a blind widow with almost nothing trying to raise a traumatized 5-year-old alone, and had instead found Emmanuel sitting contentedly on the floor while Rosario braided string into small shapes for him to feel and name, teaching him the words for triangle and square and circle through his fingertips since she could not show him pictures. "She has less than almost anyone in this barangay," Aling Feli would say for years afterward, whenever the story came up, which it did more and more often as Emmanuel's name began appearing in newspapers, and somehow she gave that boy more attention, more patience, more actual presence than families with twice the money ever managed to give their own children who had 2 working eyes in the house. I used to bring her a little extra rice when I could, and she would always try to give half of it back, telling me some other family needed it more than they did, even when I could see plainly that they needed it plenty themselves. The other children of the barangay had been unkind at first, the way children often are toward anything unfamiliar, teasing Emmanuel for having the blind lady as his mother instead of a real family, until one afternoon, when Emmanuel was 7, a boy considerably larger than him had pushed him into the mud outside the schoolhouse for exactly this reason, and Emmanuel had come home crying, describing the incident to Rosario in halting, humiliated sentences. Rosario had listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she had pulled him close and said something he would repeat decades later in a business school guest lecture that a recording of would eventually circulate with several million views online, though none of the young entrepreneurs watching it ever quite grasped the full weight of where it had originally come from. "Let them laugh at what they can see and don't understand," she told him. "I cannot see at all, and I understand more about what actually matters than most people who can see everything. Being different from what people expect is not a wound, Anak. It is only a wound if you let other people's narrow eyes become the measure of your own worth." Present day, Daniel reached the small dirt path leading to what had once been his mother's house, and stopped so completely that a passing tricycle driver had to swerve slightly around him, because where the small, single-room house of his childhood had stood, there was now a 2-story home with a proper concrete foundation, a covered veranda, a small garden with actual flowering plants instead of the packed dirt yard he remembered, and parked in a paved area beside it a black SUV that looked entirely, jarringly out of place on a road this narrow and this poor. His first thought, arriving quickly and with the particular ugly speed of a man already primed by shame to expect the worst, was that his mother must have died, that strangers now occupied whatever this place had become, that he had come home to nothing at all, not even the poverty he had braced himself to find. His second thought, following close behind the first, and somehow worse, was that perhaps she had remarried, that some other man had built this life around her, while her actual son had vanished into his own failures 3 hours away by bus, a thought that filled him with an irrational, undeserved anger he had no right to feel. He walked up to the veranda slowly, and it was there, sitting in a rattan chair in the late afternoon light, with her hands moving over a basket of mung beans she was sorting by touch, that he saw her. Older, much older than the woman he had left, her hair fully white now instead of streaked with the grey he remembered, her face more deeply lined, but unmistakably her, unmistakably his mother, sitting in a home that made no sense at all given everything he knew about her life. "Nane," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable in a way he hadn't expected. Rosario went very still, her hands stopping mid-motion over the beans, her blind eyes turning toward the sound with the particular precision of someone who has learned to locate people by voice alone. "Daniel?" she said, and there was no anger in it yet, only a kind of careful disbelief, as though she were testing whether the voice might be a trick of memory or exhaustion. "Is that you? Is that really you, Anak?" "It's me, Nane," he said, crossing the distance and kneeling in front of her chair, and she reached out immediately, the way she always had, searching for his face with both hands, and when she found it, when her fingers traced the new hollows in his cheeks, the leaner jaw, the stubble he hadn't bothered shaving on the long bus ride down, her expression shifted into something between joy and alarm. "You are too thin," she said. "What has happened to you? Where have you been all this time? 15 years, Daniel. 15 years without a letter, without a call in 3 of them. I thought—" She stopped herself, her hands still on his face, and did not finish the sentence, though Daniel understood exactly what she had almost said, understood it the way a man understands a wound he has caused but never had to look at directly until this exact moment. Before he could answer, a voice came from inside the house, warm and familiar in a way that confused Daniel completely, a voice he did not recognize, but that spoke with the easy comfort of someone who lived here, who belonged here, in a way Daniel, standing awkwardly on his own mother's veranda, suddenly did not. "Nane, who's here?" A man stepped out onto the veranda, perhaps in his late 30s, dressed simply but in clothes that were unmistakably expensive in their simplicity. The kind of understated quality that Daniel, who had spent a decade around businessmen before losing everything, recognized instantly as real money, rather than performed money. The man stopped short when he saw Daniel kneeling by Rosario's chair, and something crossed his face, quick and complicated, gone before Daniel could fully read it. "Daniel," Rosario said, her hand finding her son's shoulder and holding it, as though anchoring herself between 2 points of a conversation she had not expected to be having today. "This is Emmanuel. Manny, he is—" She paused, and Daniel would think for a long time afterward about the particular weight of that pause, the careful way his mother chose the next words. "He is also my son." The man named Emmanuel Cruz studied Daniel for a long moment, an expression on his face that held none of the hostility Daniel might have expected, and none of the warmth Daniel might have hoped for. Only a kind of careful, measuring calm, the calm of someone who has learned, through long practice, not to reveal more than he intends to in a single glance. "You must be the son who went to Manila," Emmanuel said finally, his voice even, giving nothing away. "Nane talks about you sometimes, less these last few years." The sentence landed exactly where Daniel suspected it was meant to land, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact laid on the table between them, the kind of fact that didn't need embellishment to hurt. "I should have called more," Daniel said, standing now, feeling suddenly and acutely underdressed, undersized, in front of this stranger who occupied a space in his mother's life and his mother's home that Daniel could not yet fully understand. "I should have done a lot of things. I'm here now." "You're here now," Emmanuel repeated, with a tone Daniel couldn't quite place, somewhere between acknowledgement and challenge. He turned to Rosario. "Nane, do you want me to prepare the guest room, or should I give you two some time first?" "Prepare the room, Anak," Rosario said, patting Daniel's hand where it still rested near her shoulder. Though her voice had gathered a firmness Daniel remembered from childhood, the voice she used when she had already decided something and was simply informing the room of her decision rather than asking permission. "My son has come a long way. He will stay as long as he needs to." Emmanuel nodded once and went back inside without another word, and Daniel watched him go with a confusion that felt, in that moment, almost as heavy as the shame that had brought him home in the first place. He had 1,000 questions crowding behind his teeth, questions about the house, about the SUV, about who exactly this man was, and why he moved through Rosario's home with the easy authority of someone who had built it himself. But the question that came out first, when he finally sat down across from his mother on the veranda, was smaller and more urgent than any of them. "Nanai, whose house is this? Where did all this come from?" Rosario was quiet for a moment, her sightless eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, the way they always turned when she was choosing her words with particular care. "This is Emmanuel's house, Daniel," she said finally. "He built it for us 6 years ago. Before that, we lived in the same small house you grew up in, the one with the leaking roof, you remember, for a long time after you left. Built it for you," Daniel repeated slowly, something cold moving through his chest as pieces he did not yet have the full picture of began, uneasily, to assemble themselves. "With what money, Nane? Who is he?" "He is the richest man in this province now," Rosario said, without any particular emphasis, the way a person states a fact about the weather. "Perhaps in 3 provinces, according to what people tell me, though I have never much cared for that part of it. He owns companies I do not fully understand, something with computers and shipping and buildings in the city. But before any of that, Daniel, he was a 5-year-old boy, standing alone in a rice paddy in the middle of the night, and I was the only person in this world who walked toward the sound of him screaming instead of away from it. 12 years earlier, when Emmanuel was 10 years old, Rosario had walked him to school every morning, along the same dirt road she had walked her own son along years before, her hand resting on his shoulder, while he described, in the careful, patient way he had learned to describe things for her, every detail of the road ahead, the puddle to step around, the carabao grazing near the ditch, the neighbor sweeping her yard, becoming in this daily practice repeated across years, not just her guide, but her eyes, in a way that had shaped something quiet and permanent in both of them. She could not read to him, could not check his homework the way sighted mothers checked homework, could not see the drawings he brought home from school, proudly holding up for her approval, before remembering each time with a small flash of sadness that never fully disappeared even after years of practice, that she could not see them. But she had taught him other things, things that did not require sight, how to listen to a person's voice and know when they were telling the truth, how to feel the weight of rice in his palm and know whether it had been properly dried, how to sit with someone who was suffering without immediately trying to fix it, simply by staying present, by not looking away. Because looking away, she told him once, was the one luxury a blind woman had never been able to afford, and had therefore never learned to want. "You are going to leave this village someday," she told him when he was 12, sitting together on the same veranda steps of the old, leaking roofed house, shelling peanuts in the fading evening light. "I can feel it in the way you ask questions, always wanting to know how things work, why they work that way, whether they could work better. That is a good thing, Emmanuel. But when you leave, and you will leave, I want you to remember this. It does not matter how much money you make out there. What matters is whether you become the kind of person who still knows how to hold someone in the dark when they are screaming, the way I held you, without needing anything back for it." Emmanuel had carried that instruction through every year that followed, through a scholarship to a science high school in the provincial capital that Rosario had insisted he apply for, despite having no way to pay for the additional costs it would require, costs she covered by taking in more laundry, more mending, more of the exhausting handwork that blind fingers can still perform with enough practice and enough necessity. He carried it through a scholarship to university in Manila, through the first small software company he started with 2 classmates in a rented room barely bigger than his childhood home, through the failures that came before the successes, through the eventual acquisition that made him, at 34, wealthier than anyone in 3 provinces had any real frame of reference to understand. He had returned to the barangay the moment the acquisition closed, not to show off the way Daniel once might have imagined doing in his own younger, hungrier years, but to find Rosario exactly where he had left her, in the same small house with the same leaking roof, refusing every offer of money he had tried to send over the preceding years because, she told him firmly each time, she did not need it. She had everything she needed, and money sent from a distance felt to her too much like the money her biological son used to send in his first years away. Money that had arrived less and less often until it stopped arriving at all. Money that had never once been accompanied by the boy himself. The company that made him wealthy had started small and stayed small for far longer than Emmanuel liked to admit in the interviews he occasionally gave once journalists became interested in his story. A piece of software originally designed to help small provincial shipping operations track inventory without the expensive enterprise systems only large companies could afford, built in that rented room with 2 university classmates on a budget so thin that Emmanuel had, for the first 18 months, eaten exactly 1 meal a day to stretch what little capital they had raised from a small business grant meant for young entrepreneurs. The breakthrough had come slowly, then all at once, the way breakthroughs in ambitious young companies so often do. A moderate regional success that caught the attention of a much larger logistics conglomerate looking to modernize its own systems. A licensing deal that gave the small company its first real capital. And then, over the following 6 years, an expansion into shipping, into warehousing technology, into a dozen adjacent businesses that Emmanuel had built with the same patient, unglamorous persistence Rosario had taught him on her veranda step, shelling peanuts, holding him through screaming nights, never once looking away from difficulty simply because it was uncomfortable to face directly. He credited her publicly in every interview, in a way that made provincial journalists initially assume he was simply being sentimental for the cameras, until they understood, upon actually visiting the modest home he had built her. Upon watching him kneel at her feet each evening to describe his day to her in the exact patient detail she had once used to describe the road to school, that the sentiment was not performance at all, but the most literal truth of his entire biography. "Everyone asks me about the technology," he told one interviewer, in an answer that would eventually be printed on the wall of his company's main office as an unofficial mission statement. As though the technology is the interesting part. The interesting part is a blind woman who had nothing, choosing to walk toward a screaming child instead of away from him. Everything else I've built is just the very long, very slow echo of that one decision. "I am not sending you money, Nane," Emmanuel had told her that day, standing in the doorway of the old house with the specific determination of a man who had learned from this very woman exactly how to hold his ground with love instead of force. "I am building you a house, and I am moving into it with you, and you cannot refuse this one because I am not asking. I decided a long time ago that whatever I built in this life, the first and most important thing I would ever build would be a place for you to grow old in comfort, since you gave me the only real comfort I had when I had absolutely nothing at all." Present day. Daniel sat on the veranda of the house his mother's adopted son had built, absorbing all of this with a slowness that felt to him almost physically painful, each new detail landing like a small, precise blow. He thought of his own 15 years, the promises made and quietly abandoned, the calls that grew fewer and then stopped, the specific cowardice of choosing silence over the discomfort of admitting failure to a woman who could not even see his face to judge it, only hear his voice, which meant she would have heard in that voice exactly the shame he had been trying so hard to hide. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" Daniel asked. An unfair question, and he knew it even as he said it. The old reflex of shifting blame surfacing before he could stop it. "I tried in the beginning," Rosario said without any anger in her voice, though there was a tiredness in it that Daniel understood to be its own kind of judgment, quieter and more devastating than any accusation could have been. I told you in one of your calls that we had taken in a boy from the fire. You said that was good of me, and then you asked about something else, some deal you were working on in Manila, and the conversation moved on, and it kept moving on like that every time I tried to bring him up again, until eventually I stopped trying, because I understood that you had made room in your life for the person you used to be, and there was no room left over for anyone standing still in this village, including him, including me. The words did not come with cruelty, which somehow made them land harder. The plain, unadorned honesty of a woman who had spent 15 years accepting a version of loss that most people would have spent those same years raging against. Emmanuel came back out onto the veranda then, having overheard at least the last part of the conversation from just inside the doorway, and he sat down on the step below Rosario's chair with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent years in exactly this configuration, at her feet, within reach of her hand. "I'm not going to pretend I don't have complicated feelings about you," Emmanuel said to Daniel, with a directness that Daniel found, despite everything, easier to respect than a polite lie would have been. "I grew up hearing your name mentioned less and less by a woman who loved you enough to keep hoping you'd call, long after any reasonable person would have stopped hoping. I watched what that unanswered hope did to her quietly over years. So no, I don't have some simple, generous feeling about the timing of your return, showing up now, exactly when I understand you have nothing left of your own." "That's fair," Daniel said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it completely, that some part of him had been waiting 15 years for someone to say precisely this to him without flinching. "But," Emmanuel continued, and something in his tone shifted, softening at the edges without losing its firmness, "she is the reason I am the man I am today, in every way that actually matters, far more than any deal I have ever closed or any company I have ever built. And she loves you still completely, in a way I have never fully understood, because I did not grow you inside her body the way she grew you. And I think that kind of love does not measure things the way the rest of us measure them. So if she is willing to let you stay, I am not going to be the one standing in the doorway blocking it, even though some part of me honestly wants to." Rosario reached down and found Emmanuel's shoulder with one hand and Daniel's knee with the other, sitting between the two of them the way she had, in her own private and unspoken way, been sitting between two versions of motherhood for over a decade now, one chosen freely in the middle of the worst night of a stranger's life, and one given to her by nature, and then, for 15 long years, largely abandoned by the very nature that had given it. "I do not need either of you to compete for anything," she said, her voice carrying the particular calm authority that came, Daniel realized now, from having survived worse than this conversation many times over. "Emmanuel, you owe Danielle nothing, and I will not pretend otherwise to make this moment easier for anyone. Daniel, you have a great deal of repairing to do, and none of it will be finished by tomorrow or by this visit, or perhaps ever completely, and I will not pretend otherwise either, because pretending has never once fixed anything in this family." She paused, and both men waited, because it was clear she was not finished. "But I am an old blind woman who has spent 15 years missing a son I was not sure was still alive most weeks, and now that son is sitting in front of me, thin and ashamed, and finally, honest enough to come back with empty hands instead of more promises he could not keep. I am not interested in turning him away because his timing is inconvenient for the rest of us. I'm interested in whether he is willing to become someone worth having stayed for, starting now, today, in this house, doing whatever needs to be done without a single peso changing hands, because money was never the thing either of my sons owed me in the first place. 2 weeks later, Daniel was still in the house, though the arrangement remained, by everyone's unspoken agreement, tentative and unofficial. A trial period that no one had named out loud, but that everyone understood was being conducted nonetheless. He had taken to waking early, a habit left over from his years of business meetings that started before sunrise, and had begun, without being asked, doing the physical work around the property that Rosario could no longer manage on her own, and that Emmanuel, busy running companies from a laptop at the kitchen table during his increasingly frequent visits from Manila, did not have time for during his stays. He repaired the fence around the small garden. He learned, slowly and with more difficulty than he expected, to cook the specific dishes his mother liked, guided entirely by her verbal instructions, since his own memory of her cooking had faded during his years away, memories replaced by restaurant meals, and later by the thin, forgettable food of a man too broke to care what he ate. He sat with her in the evenings, describing the sky the way Emmanuel had once described the road to school, the particular color of a sunset over the rice paddies, the shape of clouds building toward the mountains before a rain, small offerings that cost him nothing but attention and that he understood, slowly, were exactly the currency his mother had been missing for 15 years, far more than any amount of remitted money. Emmanuel remained cautious, visiting from Manila every second weekend, watching Daniel's efforts with an expression that gradually softened from measured skepticism into something closer to reluctant respect, though he made no grand gesture of forgiveness, no dramatic reconciliation speech, because that was not, Daniel came to understand, how this particular man operated. Emmanuel's trust, like Rosario's own steady patience, was a thing built in small increments, through repeated, unglamorous proof, not granted on the strength of a single moving conversation on a veranda. "You don't have to like me yet," Daniel told him one evening, the two of them alone on the veranda while Rosario napped inside. The closest thing to a direct conversation they had allowed themselves since that first difficult afternoon. "I understand that. I spent 15 years teaching everyone in my life, including myself, exactly how little my promises were worth. I'm not expecting that to reverse, because I showed up broke and humbled. I just want the chance to prove something different, slowly, the way you apparently learned everything that actually matters from her." Emmanuel considered this for a long moment, looking out at the darkening rice paddies. "She used to tell me," he said finally, "that the measure of a person isn't the promise they make when things are easy. It's what they choose to keep doing after everyone would understand if they quit." He glanced sideways at Daniel. "You quit once already. On her, for 15 years. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter to me. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't understand, better than almost anyone, what it looks like when someone finally decides to stay." 3 months into Daniel's return, a complication arrived that tested exactly the fragile new equilibrium the household had built. A logistics company based in the provincial capital, one of Emmanuel's competitors in the shipping side of his business empire, approached Daniel directly, having heard through local gossip that the disgraced brokerage owner from Manila was staying at the Cruz residence, and offered him a modest consulting position, precisely the kind of face-saving professional opportunity Daniel had spent 3 months quietly, desperately hoping might eventually appear. The catch, delivered almost as an afterthought during the interview, was that the position would require Daniel to share certain operational insights about shipping routes and client relationships that, while not directly proprietary to Emmanuel's company, would nonetheless give this competitor a meaningful advantage in the regional market Emmanuel had spent years carefully building. Daniel sat with the offer for 2 full days before mentioning it to anyone, turning over in his mind the particular shape of the compromise being offered to him. A real job, real income. The first genuine chance at rebuilding some version of his old life in exchange for information that would, even indirectly, work against the very family who had taken him back in when he had nothing. He told Emmanuel about it on the 3rd evening, watching his face carefully as he described the offer, half expecting suspicion, half expecting some quiet, understandable assumption that Daniel had already decided to take it. "What did you tell them?" Emmanuel asked, his tone giving nothing away. "I told them I needed to think about it," Daniel said, "and I have been thinking about it. And I'm telling you now, instead of telling you after I'd already said yes, because I think that's actually the whole test here, isn't it? Not whether I take the job, whether I come to you first, honestly, before deciding." Emmanuel studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression, for the first time since Daniel's arrival, opened into something unguarded. "I wasn't testing you," he said, "but I understand why it might have felt that way, and for what it's worth, I'd have found out either way. Not because I'm watching you, but because this province is small and everyone talks." He paused. "What are you going to tell them?" "That I'm not interested," Daniel said, and found, saying it, that the decision had already fully formed itself somewhere beneath his conscious deliberating, the way right decisions sometimes do when a person has finally stopped negotiating with his own worst instincts. "Not because of loyalty I haven't earned the right to claim yet. Because I spent 15 years making choices that were good for me and bad for the people who trusted me, and I am tired, Manny. I am tired of being that particular kind of person." It was the first time Daniel had used the shortened name. The name Rosario used, the name that belonged until that moment only to family, and Emmanuel noticed it. Daniel could see him notice it, though neither of them commented on it directly, letting the small, quiet significance of it simply exist in the space between them. 4 months into Daniel's return, a crisis arrived that tested the fragile new trust more thoroughly than any conversation could have. Rosario collapsed one morning while watering the small garden, a sudden dizziness that Daniel, working nearby on the fence, caught only the tail end of, turning just in time to see her sway and reach for something to steady herself that wasn't there. He caught her before she hit the ground, and the following hour unfolded with a terror that Daniel had not felt since the worst weeks of his company's collapse, except entirely different in kind, because this terror had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a woman he had spent 15 years failing and had only just begun to try to stop failing. He called for the neighbor's motorcycle, the fastest transportation available on the narrow barangay road, and rode with Rosario to the small district hospital 40 minutes away, holding her hand the entire way while she drifted in and out of a consciousness that frightened him more each time it slipped. He called Emmanuel from the hospital, his hands shaking so badly he had to try the number twice, and Emmanuel, in Manila for a board meeting, he cancelled without a second thought the moment he heard Daniel's voice, arrived by private car 4 hours later, having driven the distance himself rather than wait for a flight that would have taken almost as long once ground transit on either end was accounted for. The doctors determined it was a blood pressure crisis, dangerous but treatable, complicated by the fact that Rosario, in her characteristic refusal to be any trouble to anyone, had been quietly rationing her own medication for months, stretching a 30-day prescription across nearly 2, because she had decided, without telling either of her sons, that the cost was more than she wanted Emmanuel to keep covering on top of everything else he already provided. "Nanay," Emmanuel said, sitting at her bedside once she was stabilized, his voice carrying a rare, raw edge that Daniel had not heard in him before. "Why would you do this? Why would you risk your life over money you know I have more than enough of? Because there has to be some part of this life that is still mine to manage, Rosario said, her voice weak but entirely unapologetic. You have given me a house, a garden, a son who has finally come home. I did not want to also need you for the very last thing, the medicine that keeps this body running. I wanted just once to be the one giving something instead of only ever receiving. It was Daniel, oddly, who understood this reasoning first and most completely, recognizing in it something of his own long, complicated relationship with pride and shame, and the specific human need to feel that one is still contributing something rather than only ever being carried. Nanai, he said, taking her other hand, let me handle the medication from now on. Not Manny's money. My own, whatever I manage to earn doing whatever work I can find here. It will be small, I know that, but it will be mine to give you, and that might matter to both of us in a way Manny's money, as much as he loves you, cannot quite reach. Rosario considered this, her sightless eyes moving between the general directions of her two sons, and finally nodded. That, she said, I will accept. Daniel found work within the following 2 weeks at a rice mill on the edge of the barangay, physical labor that paid modestly but honestly. And from his very first wage, he set aside a portion for his mother's medication, a gesture so small in absolute terms that it would have meant nothing at all in his old life of six-figure contracts and imported watches. And that meant, in this new arrangement, more than almost anything else he had done since returning. 5 months into his return, Daniel finally worked up the courage to call Isabel, his daughter, now 14 years old and living with her mother in Cebu, a call he had been postponing with the same cowardly logic that had once kept him from calling his own mother, telling himself he would wait until he had something more impressive to offer than an apology. Isabel answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying the particular guarded neutrality of a teenager who has learned not to expect much from a father who had grown steadily more absent even before the physical distance of the divorce made the absence official. Dad, she said, not a question, simply an acknowledgement, the tone giving away nothing about whether the call was welcome. I know I don't have the right to call after this long, Daniel said, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. Months of rehearsed apology arriving all at once instead of in the careful order he had planned. I know I disappeared into my own failure, and let that be an excuse to disappear from you too, which was never fair to you, and I've been trying these past months to become someone who doesn't do that anymore. I'm not asking you to trust that yet. I just wanted you to hear it directly from me instead of hearing about it secondhand someday. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Daniel feared she had simply set the phone down and walked away, until she finally spoke again, her voice smaller than before, less guarded. Lola Rosario used to send me letters, Isabel said, even after you stopped calling. Did you know that? She would dictate them to a neighbor since she can't write anymore, and they'd arrive maybe twice a year. Just her asking how I was doing in school, telling me she loved me even though she'd only met me twice as a baby before you two stopped visiting. Daniel had not known this, and the discovery landed with a particular, specific pain, the realization that his own mother had continued reaching toward a granddaughter she barely knew, long after her own son had stopped reaching toward her, that the capacity for showing up, which he had spent 15 years failing to practice, had never once been absent in Rosario, only absent in him. I'd like to write to you too, Daniel said. Or call, if you'd ever want that. No pressure, no expectations. Just so you know, the door isn't closed from my side anymore, whatever you decide to do with that. Isabel was quiet again, and then said, in a voice that held the first genuine warmth of the entire conversation, Lola always says you'll come around eventually. She never stopped believing that, even when I stopped believing it myself. Maybe I can start believing it again too, slowly. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not anything close to the relationship Daniel had once imagined he might someday rebuild with his daughter, but it was a door left open. The same kind of door Rosario herself had left open for 15 years, without ever knowing for certain whether anyone would ever walk back through it. And Daniel understood, hanging up the phone that evening, that he had just been handed by his own daughter the exact same undeserved grace his mother had been extending to him his entire life, without him ever once noticing how much it had cost her to keep extending it. 6 months after Daniel's return, Rosario celebrated her 73rd birthday on the veranda of the house Emmanuel had built her, surrounded by neighbors who had known her for decades, by Emmanuel himself, present for the entire week specifically for the occasion, and by Daniel, who had spent the preceding month teaching himself, from an old cookbook and a great deal of patient verbal correction from his mother, how to prepare the specific birthday dish she had always loved and that he had never once, in 15 years away, thought to learn. "You didn't have to do all this," Rosario said, though her smile, tracing the shape of the modest feast laid out before her with her fingers as Daniel described each dish, told a different story than her words. "I owed you a lot more than one meal," Daniel said. "This is just the smallest possible start." Emmanuel, sitting nearby, raised the modest glass of soft drink he was holding, a gesture that felt in this humble setting more meaningful than the champagne toasts Daniel remembered from his old life in Manila, toasts made in rooms full of people who would have vanished entirely the moment his money did. "To Nane," Emmanuel said, "who taught both of us in completely different ways and completely different years the same exact lesson, that showing up again and again without needing anything back for it is the only kind of wealth that actually keeps its value." Rosario, sitting between the two men who had each in such different fashions become her sons, reached out and found both their hands, holding them together in her lap, the way she had once held peanuts to be shelled, the way she had once held a screaming 5-year-old in a dark rice paddy, the way she had once held the hand of a young man leaving for a bus 15 years ago and memorized his face one final time with her fingers before he vanished for a decade and a half. "I'm not rich," she said, "not the way people in the city mean it. I have never once in my life held very much money in my own 2 hands. But I raised a billionaire, and I raised him not because I ever wanted anything from him, but because a child was screaming in the dark, and I walked toward the sound instead of away from it. And now, after 15 years, I have my other son back too, walking toward something instead of away from it for the first time since he left." She squeezed both their hands. "That is more wealth than any bank in this province could ever hold, and I would not trade 1 peso of it for anything either of you has ever earned." 8 months into Daniel's return, Emmanuel invited him, for the first time, to accompany him on one of his business trips to the provincial capital, not out of any particular need for Daniel's presence, but as a gesture that both men understood carried weight beyond its practical purpose. An invitation into a part of Emmanuel's life that had, until then, remained entirely separate from the fragile domestic peace they had built at Rosario's house. They drove together in the black SUV that had so confused Daniel on his first afternoon back, and somewhere along the winding provincial highway, in the particular loosened honesty that long car rides sometimes produce between men who might otherwise struggle to speak directly to each other, Emmanuel began talking about the years Daniel had missed, not with bitterness now, but with something closer to simple narration, filling in a history Daniel had only heard in fragments. "There were nights, especially the first year," Emmanuel said, eyes on the road, "when I would wake up certain the house was burning again. Nana would hear me and come to my room, even though she couldn't see anything at all, and she'd just sit with me until it passed, telling me over and over that she was there, that I wasn't in the fire anymore. She did that for probably 2 years straight, before the nightmares finally stopped coming as often." "I didn't know any of that," Daniel said quietly. You couldn't have, Emmanuel said without accusation, simply fact. You were building your own life. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse. I'm telling you because I think you should actually know her, the real shape of what she did. Not just the version where she waited faithfully for you to come back. She built an entire second childhood out of nothing, for a boy who wasn't even hers, while also still hoping every single day that her actual son would eventually call. Daniel absorbed this in silence for a long stretch of highway, watching rice paddies blur past the window, before finally saying the thing he had been circling for months, without quite finding the courage to say directly. I used to resent you a little these past months, if I'm honest. Not because of anything you did. Just because you got to be the son who stayed, who noticed, who actually built her the life she deserved, while I was 3 hours away pretending my absence didn't cost anything. I understand that, Emmanuel said. But I want to tell you something Nane told me once, years ago, when I asked her if it bothered her that you never called. She said that love isn't a fixed amount you divide between people, where more for one person automatically means less for another. She said the fact that she loved me completely never once made her love you any less, and the fact that you eventually came back doesn't make what I built with her over these years mean any less either. There's room for both of us to have been exactly what we were to her, Daniel. I stopped needing you to feel guilty about that a long time ago. I think it's time you stopped needing to feel like you're competing with me for it too. Something in Daniel's chest loosened at that, a tension he hadn't fully realized he was carrying until it began, slowly, to release. Thank you, he said, for saying that, and for everything else. The house, the years you gave her that I didn't. I know I can't repay any of it, and I know you're not asking me to. But thank you. Emmanuel glanced over, the corner of his mouth lifting into something that was almost, for the first time since Daniel's return, an easy smile. You can start by actually learning to cook her birthday dish properly, he said. I've heard the last attempt was memorable for the wrong reasons. Daniel laughed, surprised by how naturally it came. The first real laugh he could remember sharing with another person in longer than he wanted to admit. She told you about that. She tells me everything, Emmanuel said. That's kind of the whole point of her, isn't it? They arrived at the provincial capital an hour later, and Emmanuel spent the afternoon in meetings, while Daniel waited in a small cafe nearby, watching through the window the ordinary bustle of a town he had once considered enormous as a boy, and now, after 15 years in Manila, saw clearly for the modest, unremarkable place it actually was, a recalibration of scale that felt in its own small way like part of the same larger recalibration his entire homecoming had forced on him. He thought, watching tricycles pass and vendors call out their wares, about how much of his old ambition had been built on exactly this kind of distorted scale, measuring his worth against cities and numbers so large they made everything smaller than them feel like failure by comparison. And how strange it was that the actual measure of a life, the one his mother had spent 73 years quietly demonstrating, without ever once raising her voice about it, had nothing to do with scale at all. On the drive back that evening, the sun setting orange over the rice paddies, exactly the way Daniel had once described it to his mother from the veranda, Emmanuel broke a long, comfortable silence with a question Daniel hadn't expected. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "The 15 years. If you could go back to that morning at the bus stop, would you make a different choice?" Daniel considered this honestly, turning the question over with more care than he gave most questions these days. "I don't think I regret leaving," he said finally. "The village needed young people to go find opportunity somewhere, and I don't think staying would have made me a better son automatically. What I regret is the specific years of silence, the choosing not to call because calling meant admitting something. That part, yes. I would go back and change that part in an instant if I could. That's the part that actually mattered, Emmanuel said quietly. The leaving was never really the wound. It was the silence afterward. Daniel nodded, watching the rice paddies blur past, understanding, perhaps more completely in that single sentence than in any of the previous 8 months combined, exactly what he had spent 15 years failing to understand on his own. 1 year after Daniel's return, the household had settled into a rhythm that none of the three of them could have predicted on that first tense afternoon on the veranda. Daniel had moved from the rice mill to a small logistics consulting role that a regional company, hearing of his background and, more quietly, his connection to Emmanuel. Though Emmanuel had insisted on staying entirely uninvolved in the hiring decision to ensure Daniel's position was earned rather than gifted, had offered him after a trial period, proved he still had genuine expertise worth paying for, modest as the salary was compared to his old life. He called Isabel every week now, conversations that had grown slowly, from careful and guarded into something approaching the easy familiarity of an actual father and daughter, and he had begun planning a visit to Cebu, the first time he would see her in person in over 3 years. A trip Rosario had insisted on funding herself from her own small savings over both her sons' objections, because, she said, some journeys a mother simply has to be allowed to pay for. Rosario's birthday came around again, her 74th, and this time Daniel's rendition of her favorite dish required no correction at all, prepared entirely from memory now. Muscle memory built over a full year of practice. And as the three of them sat together on the veranda in the fading evening light, neighbors coming and going with small gifts and greetings, Rosario reached out and found both her son's hands the way she always did, holding them together in her lap. Arling Faley stopped by that evening too, as she did every year, and stood for a moment at the edge of the veranda, watching the three of them together before finally saying, to no one in particular, I have watched this family for over 30 years now, through a fire, through a departure, through more silence than any mother should have had to carry alone. And I have never once seen it look as complete as it looks tonight. Rosario, hearing this, only smiled and said that completeness had never been about how many people sat on a veranda, but about whether the people who did sit there had finally learned to stay. A year ago, she said, I had one son sitting beside me, and one son I hoped every single day might still come home. Now I have both of you actually here, actually present, in a way I stopped believing I would ever get to have again. She squeezed their hands. I do not know how many more birthdays I have left in this life, but I know that whatever number it is, I will spend every single one of them exactly like this, between the two of you. And there is no amount of money in any bank in this country that could ever be worth more than that to me. The barangay itself had watched Daniel's return with the same patient, collective skepticism it reserved for anyone whose absence had once been notable enough to become local conversation, and had, over the course of that first year, slowly revised its judgment through the same accumulation of small, unremarkable proof that had convinced Emmanuel and, eventually, fully convinced Rosario herself. Arling Faley, still barangay captain after all these years, remarked once to a neighbor, within earshot of Daniel himself working at the rice mill, that she had seen a great many prodigal sons return over her decades in that position, and that the difference between the ones who stayed and the ones who eventually drifted away again wasn't in how dramatic their apology had been on arrival, but in whether they were still doing the small, unglamorous work of showing up 6 months later when no one was watching closely anymore, and the drama of the homecoming had long since faded into ordinary daily life. That one, she said, nodding toward Daniel carrying sacks of rice without complaint in the afternoon heat, is still here, still doing the boring parts. That's usually how you know. Daniel overheard this and said nothing to her directly, but carried the observation with him for the rest of that day, understanding it as perhaps the truest verdict anyone in the barangay had yet delivered on the actual state of his redemption. Not a verdict rendered in words, but one being rendered slowly and continuously in the accumulating weight of ordinary days. Let me tell you something about the two different ways a person can arrive at someone's door. One way is with your hands full, your pockets heavy, arriving, because arriving is easy when you already have everything you need. The other way is with your hands completely empty, arriving because you have finally run out of every other option, forced at last into the kind of honesty that abundance always lets us avoid. Daniel Bautista spent 15 years building a life around the first kind of arrival, always promising to return once his hands were full enough to make the homecoming worth celebrating. And in that specific, understandable delay, he missed almost everything that actually mattered. A fire in the night, a screaming orphan child, a blind woman's decision to walk towards suffering instead of away from it, and the entire, slow, patient miracle of watching that decision grow over 12 quiet years into the richest man in 3 provinces. Rosario Bautista never once had full hands in her entire life. She had a house with a leaking roof, rice most days and meat maybe twice a month, and eyes that had not seen a single sunrise in over a decade. And out of that particular total poverty, she built something that no amount of money could have purchased. A home for a child no one else wanted. A lesson repeated so many times it became instinct. And eventually, without ever asking for a single peso of repayment, the quiet architecture of an actual billionaire's entire moral character. And here is the part of this story that stays with me longest after telling it. Emmanuel never once needed Daniel to disappear in order to become who he became. Rosario never once needed her biological son's absence in order to love the boy who stayed. The wealth Emmanuel built, the peace Rosario found, none of it depended on Daniel's failure, the way Daniel, in his worst private moments of shame, half expected it might. Redemption in this family was never a competition with a limited number of seats. It turned out to be, the whole time, simply a door that stayed open, waiting for whoever was finally ready to walk back through it, no matter how empty their hands were when they arrived. So let me ask you something. Is there someone in your life you've been meaning to call? Someone you've let the silence grow around because calling means admitting something you're not ready to admit yet? And is there someone else, maybe, who took you in when you had absolutely nothing to offer back? Someone whose patient, unglamorous kindness you've never properly repaid, not with money, but with the one thing that actually would have mattered, simply showing up again and again the way they once showed up for you. Write their names in the comments, both of them, if you have both. Tell me what it would take for you to finally make that call, or what it would take for you to finally say thank you to the person who walked toward you in your own particular dark. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't building an empire. It's admitting, with completely empty hands, that it's time to go home, and trusting that the door might still be open even after all this time, even after everything you did to make it reasonable for someone to have locked it long ago. If this story reached something in you that you weren't expecting, hit that like button and send it to someone who's been carrying the specific shame of unreturned calls, of promises that quietly stopped being kept. Because next week, there's another story waiting here. And the people who keep coming back for these stories are usually the same people finally brave enough to pick up that phone, to finally walk toward the sound instead of away from it. Exactly the way it mattered most, exactly the way an entire fortune once began, with nothing more than one blind woman refusing to look away. Thank you for being here. And if there's a blind mother somewhere still listening for your voice on the other end of a phone that hasn't rung in years, call her tonight. You might be surprised, the way Daniel was, by exactly what your absence left behind, and exactly what might still be waiting for you to finally come home to. That's everything. See you next week.